I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop. I was contacted recently by some customers who wanted me to build them a TV console to go below their TV and a couple floating shelves for above the TV. Quick shot of the apprentice before we get started. So for me, this is a fairly small project. Really, it would be about the smallest project I would want to take on that I could make money doing. Oftentimes when I have these small projects, I like to use them as an opportunity to experiment with some new techniques and methods. And that's what I did with this job. And at this point, I'd like to take just a second to thank the YouTube community. I learned so much from watching YouTube videos, including the method of making some edge banding clamps that I'll show in this video. And it's really quite ingenious, and I probably never would have figured it out on my own without YouTube. So I got started in the normal way of ripping out some strips and then cutting them to length to make up the sides and the top and bottom. So this is the new method that I wanted to try out. I've really been disappointed with iron-on edge banding, and I don't have 40,000 bucks to go buy a nice edge bander. It's important to note that I don't do a ton of edge banding. If I did, I would probably find a way to get some money together to go buy a real nice edge bander, but for the most part I do face frame cabinets, and I only occasionally do edge banding for shelves or other small projects. So in the past I'd used blue tape to clamp on solid wood edge banding, but that method is a little slow and cumbersome. So in watching some YouTube videos, I came across a guy who put a bike inner tube on some spring clamps, and I said, yep, that's the solution right there. So I found on Amazon some cheap spring clamps. If you buy them 10 at a time, they're $1.39 each. I think I ended up buying like 150 or something. And I bought some cheap bike inner tubes, and this was my process for making my edge banding clamps. And you know what? Overall, these things work really good. So excited I thought I'd treat myself to some wheelie practice. So now that I have a good way to clamp the edge banding on, you might be asking yourself, well, how do you trim it back? Well, fortunately I have a lipping planer, which makes this job pretty quick. And the great thing about the solid wood edge banding is you can put a little round over on it, you can sand it. Here I'm just cutting off the bandsaw marks. The last piece of the puzzle is a way to trim the ends, and I got this little attachment that goes on a biscuit cutter, and it allows the cutter to be used in a kind of a 90-degree vertical fashion. And you can see here it trims off the end of solid wood edge banding just perfectly. Here's my latest toy. Oh, did I say toy? I meant tool. It's made by Mafell, and it's called the dowler. And it drills 2 holes on 32mm centers, so here I'm just using it to drill my hinge plate holes. And here I'm using it along with its track to do just a short series of shelf pin holes. Really, it's things like the Festool Domino, except you use dowels instead of the kind of the loose tenons that Festool uses. This is a really, really precise tool, really well made, and it's definitely not cheap, but overall I think it's a really good tool that's going to get a lot of use in my shop. So now I'm just moving on to building the toe kicks. It's 3/4 inch plywood, whatever I got left over laying around the shop. So I had a little staple blowout, and here's a way to remove the staples or pneumatic nails below the surface. If you just take some cutters and kind of wiggle, it ends up breaking the nail off below the surface. So I like to have a separate toe kick. It just makes installing and leveling the cabinet on site a lot easier, I think, because I can just install the toe kick, use shims, level it, attach it to the wall, and then I know I've got a perfect surface to set my cabinets on. Just like the shakers, place for everything and everything in its place. Actually, I wish I was more like the Shakers. Shop organization is really something I've always struggled with, and this is a fairly new shop. I've been in it for about 2 years now, and I hope in the next year or so I'll be able to have a little bit more time and money to build some more fixtures to help keep my shop organized and keep me efficient. All right, now it's time to move on to building some doors. So what's neat about this method of door construction is that once your parts are all milled up, really all you need is a router table and one cheap router bit. Also, it's really fast, and setup time is really fast as well. And it's a good quality door. I load a 1/4 inch slot cutting bit into my router table, and I use a couple of shims on my fence to reduce the depth of cut for the first cut, and this helps eliminate tear out. Remove the shims and it's time for the final pass. So I think what sets apart this method of door construction is that there's only one bit and one setup. And if you're doing a smaller project, taking the time to set up 2 different bits for a cope and stick it's just too much setup time. So this allows a few doors to be produced pretty quickly. Here I'm just dressing the inside edges of all the doors with a sanding disc called an Edge Tech. If you're interested in learning more about that, I do have a video specifically dedicated to the Edge Tech. So the one catch with this method of door construction is you need to have little splines to fill in the gaps made by the slot cutter. And you can see them there on the ends of the door. This really isn't a problem. I actually just use MDF, the same MDF that I'm using for the panel of the door, and just glue and tap them in with a hammer. If you wanted the door to be a little bit stronger, you could use solid wood for that as well. Next I moved on to making the 2 floating shelves that are going to be mounted above the TV. And I just use 4/4 poplar for the fronts of the shelves, and I use 1/2 inch MDF for the actual shelf surfaces. And to keep a real clean look, each shelf is made of 3 pieces. There's a top, a bottom, and then the front edge. And I hold it all together with the mighty biscuit. I absolutely love this tool. It's the Top 20 by Lamello, so the cutter's adjustable up and down. This thing probably gets used more than any other joinery tool in my shop. And one way that I really like to use this tool is it allows me to put things together without nails or screws that are visible. So I actually make these 3 separate pieces, I paint them separately, and then when I install them I use the biscuits and glue to put them all together without any visible nails, so on site I have very little touch-up work to do. And here I'm just marking all the pieces to make sure I know which one goes where. This is how I mount the floating shelves to the wall. I create some cleats, and I use pocket screws to hold the shelf to the cleat. So this is my process for making fillers, or some people call them scribes, and it's just a small piece of wood that takes up the space between the edge of the cabinet and the wall. And again, I use the biscuit joiner, and I do this so I don't have to have any nails when I'm doing on-site work. And if this doesn't make sense to you now, I took some pictures during install that show how all these parts come together, and I have a few of those pictures shown at the end of this video. So here are a couple shots of the finished product, and I really think this edge banding just looks top notch. I'm going to be using two hinge plates for this project made by Bloom, and one is a 0mm and one is a 9mm. And those are also known as full overlay and half overlay. And this is because the two doors that are on the outer edges of the cabinet, I want the door to completely overlay the edge banding. And in the center partition, I want the doors to only overlay half of the partition. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times on small projects, I take the opportunity to experiment with new methods or jigs or tricks. And here's one of them. This is a little jig by Bloom, and it drills a 10mm hole that you can install their tip-on hardware in, and tip-on is a touch latch hardware. And for years I used a surface mount tip-on that I attached to the underside of the top of the cabinet, and it worked really good. The problem is it's just not quite as clean as this method, and I think this is really slick, and I think it's the way of the future, kind of like the internet. So because this is a TV console, there's obviously going to be plugs and wires and things like that inside of the cabinet. So here I'm just creating a cutout in the adjustable shelves to make sure that those wires and plugs can still be easily accessed. So next it was time to move on to prime and paint. And here I'm using a shellac-based primer to help protect the MDF from the water-based paint that comes next. A wise man once said painting is 90% preparation, and I couldn't agree with that statement more. So here's the first of 3 coats. I'm using Sherwin-Williams Pro Classic paint, and it's in actually a Benjamin Moore color. It's actually a nice gray color when it dries. It's always a challenge to make sure that the inside corners get enough paint. That's really the challenge when spraying shaker style doors. So I let things dry for a few days and it was off for installation. And I started with the shelves, attached the cleats to the wall first. Next I made some cardboard templates so I could fit the shelves. And then I attached the shelves via the pocket screws. Next the tops and fronts went on with biscuits and glue. After the shelves were in, I turned my attention to the cabinet, and I started by installing the toe kick. Next, the box goes in, and you can see I've pulled the outlet through the back of the cabinet. Moving on to the filler, you can see I've notched the baseboard to make way for the filler. Biscuits and glue and a friction fit. Really makes for a clean, well-fitted cabinet. This is really a great shot of why I take all the time to make those fillers the way that I do. Here's a shot of the countertop fitted in place. Here are a few horrible cell phone pics of the finished product. The sunlight coming through the windows really made getting a good picture a challenge. At some point, the customers are going to put some wallpaper up on that back wall. Here's my favorite picture of the finished project. Doors line up just perfect. The gaps are really even. I was real pleased with the way this turned out. And why not finish up with a little fun on 2 wheels, or 1 wheel in this case. Thanks for watching. Till next time.